Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to the Spain or Catalunya post-race reaction. What was your thoughts on this race? Were you excited that Lando made pole, and so you're thinking that McLaren was going to actually fight for a win in this race? Or were you thinking that, Mercedes was going to come back and have a good fight, and when you saw George Russell, take the lead on the first corner, that they were going to be really in the mix and going to be fighting it up for that win? Or did you think, like most people, that Max Verstappen was just going to bypass everybody, win by 30 seconds without any, being pushed and just kind of gliding to a victory? Did you think this was a really good race? Did you see the overtaking that was in this race? Or was it kind of boring because most of those overtaking was due to the pit strategy of getting back out on track and having to overtake to get back to where they were? Following everybody else's kind of pit strategy because everybody started off on softs. As most of the field was on the same kind of strategy, besides McLaren, who kind of went a little bit longer thinking that they were going to be able to pull out something after losing the lead, trying to keep that second position, potentially trying to fight for first, but not really gaining the ground that they needed through that strategy. So did you think that McLaren lost themselves through the strategy, or was it because of Lando's poor start and didn't get the oomph he needed to keep in the lead, or even in third, as where he was? He ended up dropping back to third behind George and Max. So was that because of Lando and fighting with Max, in that regard? And was that what caused all of this, for them to actually lose the race? What was your thoughts? I thought it was generally a boring race, even though McLaren had that little weird strategy of kind of going longer than the rest of the field. Since everybody started off on softs, I thought everybody basically were following each other into the pits and out of the pits, trying not to be overtaken in the pits, trying to cut off the people behind them or ahead of them in that regard. So I think in general, it was kind of a boring race. I'd probably give it a 4 out of 5. Not quite where I wanted it to be on an average Formula One race. But what was your thoughts? Now I'll go through the drivers from the last place to first place, kind of giving my thoughts of how well they did and if anything happened to them in that regard that I know about. Maybe you know more. If you do, leave those in the comments. And if not, hopefully I'll give you some decent information in this regard. So without further ado, we will see Logan Sargent in that 20th spot. He ended up starting the race in 19th, even though he had a three-place penalty, and for actually, hindering, in qualifying. So he was impeding, in that signs, I believe it was, in the qualifying session. And it was deemed that he did that enough that he got a three-place grid penalty, which pushed him in the back if he wasn't already in the back. And then he ended up starting 19th because of his teammate starting off in the pits because of some changes that he made. So him starting off in 19th and still up in the 20th, 2 laps down. I think Logan is really struggling and still is struggling as of late. I don't think he has much time on his hands before he will be let go from that Williams. I'm wondering if they'll even do it before the end of the season to try to get someone else involved, but we'll have to wait and see. They may give him through the end of the season before replacing him. And I know his teammate was saying he was doing a decent job in running that Williams, and I know they're struggling in the Williams by themselves, but it doesn't seem like Logan's gaining any kind of ground on or even keeping up with his teammate Alex Albon. So he was kind of stayed in the back. He did have a couple of fights, mainly when he was getting passed more than passing in that regard. He did have a couple of instances where he was having to pass the people around him. Yuki was having a bad day, qualifying in 17th and ended up in 19th. He did a 2 pit stop strategy, started off on softs, like I said, most everybody did, except for Albon, and then switched to mediums on lap 16, and then switched on to hards at lap 42. He passed K-Mag on lap 16 passed K-Mag for 16th spot on lap 58, and passed Bottas for 15th spot on lap 61. and then just got thrown back on those hard tires. The hard tires did not agree with those RBs at all, and they just kind of dropped back more into the field after that part, not being able to keep up. I know they were struggling with those updates that they had in this race, trying to understand those, not gaining what they really thought. So hopefully they can get some understanding of those updates that they brought, so they can tweak those and make those correct, modifications to get them more competitive again. Alex Albon has had started from the pits, so he started off in 20th spot, ended up in 18th, and at one point he had some wind that caused him to actually go off track, losing about 10 seconds worth. Luckily, that didn't push him too far back in the field because of where he was. I have him basically passing Sargent for that 19th spot on lap 25, and then passing Tsunoda for the 18th spot on lap 60. So he kind of stayed on the back for most of this field. He did start off on mediums, switched to softs on lap 18, and then switched to another set of softs on lap 43. So mainly on mediums at the very beginning, which kind of hindered him a little bit in the running with everybody else on softs, and then switching to the softs, hopefully gaining ground, which didn't turn out to be quite the right strategy for him. Now, Kevin Magnussen got a 5-second penalty for a false start, which pushed him back a little bit in this regard. So having to take that 5-second penalty during the pit stop that he took, and that kind of pushed him a little bit farther back in the field than he should have been. He did pass Tsunoda on lap 12 for 19th, and he basically did start off on soft, switched to mediums on lap 10, and then switched to a set of hards on lap 27 and went the rest of the way on those hard tires, where he was not as competitive. Like most people found that the hard tires were not really the tire to be on in this race. So he kind of dropped back from 16th to 17th spot, probably mainly because of that 5-second penalty, pushed him back farther in the field where he couldn't gain that ground back up, but still probably outside the points, not really gaining any ground there. Valtteri Bottas, I thought was going to have a decent race, qualifying in 12th, but ended up down in 16th. He did lose 2 spots on the first lap, and then had to fight back from there. So, and I know his teammate did the same thing, so they're going to have to work on those starts for the race to see if there's anything that Stake F1 can really get together. Because I doubt it was both their driver's fault in this regard. It could have been, but I figured there's more tweaks that they need to work out on that Stake F1 when those updates that they brought to get the best starts that they need to really practice in on. Anyway, he did take 13th spot on lap 7th, passing Alonso, which was kind of cool to see him passing the wily Alonso. And then he passed his teammate Juan Yuzo for 17th on lap 15. So then he basically stayed back of the field in that regard. So I think there was some spot switching, mainly due to pit strategies that dropped him kind of in those ranges, and he really wasn't able to gain ground that he had on those hard tires that he went most of the way on from lap 27, basically. So that really hurt him, I think, as well, trying to gain all of that on that hard tires. Too bad that didn't have any extra mediums, because I think that was the strategy to go as the softest tire possible. So do a soft, medium, soft kind of format, but they weren't able to do that, so that kind of hurt them in that regard. Daniel qualified in 18th, ended up in 15th, so he kind of got beaten out in the qualifying by his teammate Yuki, but then came out in the race, beating him in the race. So that was good for Daniel, even though he's still struggling and that RB is still struggling, especially this weekend with those updates they brought. Hopefully they can find that some ground and he can kind of get that confidence back so that he can fight. I know he's trying to fight for a seat, so we'll have to see if he gets that seat or if they give that seat to someone else next year in that RB. I know that there's some push on a couple of different directions for that seat, so we'll have to see how that plays out throughout the rest of the season. I think a lot of things will start landing in place once Sainz makes his call of where he's going to end up, and it sounds like that will be relatively soon because he was saying that it was starting to become a distraction where he needs to concentrate on this season. So hopefully we'll see or hear something from him in the next couple of weeks regarding that, which will then probably cascade the rest of a lot of those extra seats that are out there. Anyway, Daniel passed K-Mag for 16th spot on lap 58, and he passed Bottas for 15th spot on lap 61. He started off on softs, switched to mediums on lap 16, and then he went all the way to lap 42 on those medium tires and switched to a set of hards. So not quite the race that he was looking for, but gaining ground, gaining a little bit more, outbeating his teammate is always a good sign for Daniel in this regard, since Yuki's been so dominant as of late. Maybe that'll give him some of the confidence and the ability to move forward, to be more competitive, more aligned with his teammate, and maybe bring those RBs up in the field. Lance Stroll started off in 14th, ended up in 14th, even though he gained a spot at the start of the race. I have him basically taking that lap 13th spot on lap 1, but then losing that later in the race. He did start off on soft, switched to mediums on lap 17, and then went to a set of hards on lap 37. So a fairly long run on those hard tires, which I said weren't the best tires, but I think they were wearing out those mediums fairly quickly, because I think those are used sets, so they weren't able to get the most out of those tires. And then the Aston Martin was still struggling this race to try to get that act together, to try to get those tweaks in line. So hopefully they can bring some updates to the Aston Martin and kind of come back where they were at the beginning of the season, being a little bit more competitive, a little bit more in the top running fields, and then instead of the lower end or midfield. Guan Yu Zhou did a fairly good job, I think, qualifying in 15th, was behind his teammate, but ended up ahead of his teammate during the race, which is always probably the better option, even though it still looks good to have those qualifying sessions. He ended up in 13th. He did lose 2 spots at the start of the race on that first lap, but he did pass Stroll for that 13th spot on lap 45. He switched to early. He was like one of the first people to switch to medium set tires on lap 9, and he went all the way to lap 41 on that medium set before switching to another set of hards, and then kind of falling back into that pack with those hard tires for the last stint. Not really gaining the ground that he wanted, but gained a decent amount in the beginning. So I think overall, especially this race where it's fairly hard to pass in general with everything, it was good to see him gaining some ground, and definitely being ahead of his teammate is always good. So I think that was a decent race for Guan Yu Zhou. Fernando kind of messed up in the very beginning and then ended up back out of the points instead of being able to fight for the points. He did lose 2 spots at the very beginning of the race where he went wide, and that kind of just cost him the whole aspect, kind of being out of sync with the rest of the field, even though he did make a few passes, like passing K-Mag for 15th spot on lap 23, passing Bottas for 14th position on lap 27, and passing Guan Yu Zhou on lap 54 for 12th, then eventually dropping back down into that same realm, and for the rest of that race, kind of staying in that 12th position. He went to lap 19 before switching to mediums, and then he switched to a hards on lap 45. And then we come to Nico Hülkenberg, who was, again, pushing towards the points and came close to getting points, but not quite where he needed to be in that running. Qualified in 13th, ended up in 11th. Basically, I have him doing a decent job, except for the speeding in the pit lane, which gave him a 5-second penalty, which didn't throw him out of the point. I mean, out of that position, because he had enough ground on Alonso at that point. But it did hurt him in the fight, where he couldn't really fight for that last point, because he would have been pushed back out because of that time penalty. So I think that hurt him in that regard, where he didn't feel obligated or to get that extra push to get ahead of Ocon in that running. But a decent race, even though both horses got penalties for different things, so they need to kind of work on their, shaping it up and making sure everything's, all their I's are dotted and all their T's are crossed, so to make sure that they don't get any of the more penalties to hurt themselves in this running. So I think besides that penalty, I think he did a decent job, which basically gives us the bottom 10 people and where they stood. And you can see basically everybody was lapped all the way up to 12th spot. So Nico Hulkenberg ended up in the lead lap as well. So that's good to see. So for the top 10, we have the two Alpines coming into the last point ranges. So Esteban Ocon qualified in 8th, ended up in 10th, gaining that extra point. I know there was some contention between those two during this race, but it was good to see them into the points again. I have Ocon losing a spot at the very beginning of the race, but he was able to pass Daniel Ricciardo for 12th on lap 41, and he worked his way up to 10th. He did start off on softs like most everybody else, switched to mediums on lap 13, and then switched to a set of hards on lap 37. Kind of staying in that range, kind of in that spot. I know he battled his teammate a little bit during those runs when they're on slightly different strategies coming out of the pits. So there's still some contention between those, and they need to get that cleared up. But they're still good to have double points for that Alpine, as we can see later. Pierre Gasly qualified in 7th, ended up in 9th, so kind of right in front of each other in the qualifying and in the race, which that's always good to see because I thought they were going to be farther back in the field. And I have him passing Juan Yuzhou for 9th on lap 41, so that gave him that last spot. In a couple of points that he's good to see. He went one lap longer than Esteban Ocon on those soft tires, switching to mediums, as well as going one lap longer, so he switched on to hards at lap 38. So they kind of ran in that regard, and then when they were pitting, basically coming out in front of each other and having a little bit of a race for those spots. But it was interesting to see, and they were kept it clean, so no issues like we've had in the last couple of races between them. We'll have to see if that kind of continues out. I know Ocon is ready to leave, it sounds like, for Alpine. I'm not sure about Pierre Gasly if he's planning on staying there or not, even though his semi of a contract. There's some debate whether he's going to stay at Alpine or not. So we'll have to see where those end up, and if anybody else comes into that team, even though they're a works team, and hopefully they can get their act together and get a little bit more push the rest of the season to gain some extra ground and get some more confidence in those drivers. Now we have Sergio Perez, who had that 3-place grid penalty for, driving that Red Bull last race with that broken rear wing that was dangerous because they thought it was going to drop off, and it did drop off a lot of debris onto the track. So he ended up getting that 3-place grid penalty. So he dropped back down to 11th spot when he started this race. But he made his way all the way up to 8th, which still not quite as good as they are hoping for, but still decent points for him. He did make it a 3-stop race. He did pass Stroll on lap 12 passed Stroll on lap 36 for 12th spot, passed Ocon on lap 51 for 9th spot, and passed Gasly on lap 60 for that 8th spot. So he kind of worked his way up closer to the end to finally get into those bigger point ranges, getting that 4 points. He started off on softs, went to 13 laps, switched to mediums on lap 31, and then switched back to another set of softs on lap 49. So he did the more traditional strategy on that regard of soft, medium, soft, which kind of made up some of that ground, gave him the ability to get past those Alpines, I think, in that regard, giving him that little extra oomph. Now we come to Oscar Piastri, who gained a position on the start of the race, but he should have been farther up in the grid to start the race to begin with. He did qualify in ninth spot, but he had those offs in the qualifying session where he didn't ever get a time in that Q3 lineup. So he was going to start off in 10th and only start off in ninth because of Sergio Perez drop of 3-place grid penalty. So he should have been farther up. He was really struggling this weekend, gaining the most out of that McLaren, really pushing it to the edge. He seemed to kind of go over the edge a little too much pressure, I think, to match Norris on some of those realms. He's still young. He's still trying to impressionable and trying to learn stuff. So I think that's part of the deal. But he's still a really good driver. As you can see that he made his way up to 7th spot, getting around some of those other cars. It sounds like McLaren probably had the fastest car on the circuit today, but you could kind of tell that being the farther back in the field, it makes it that much harder to gain ground in this running. So he did pass Hulkenberg for a 10th spot on lap 23. He passed Perez on lap 28 for 9th, passed Ocon on lap 31 for 8th, and passed Gasly on lap 34 for 7th. He started off on softs, went to lap 21, and then switched to mediums, and then he went to lap 46 where he switched back to softs. So a good run for Oscar, even though he should have been farther up due to those issues he had in qualifying. If he was up in qualifying, he may have been able to help push Lando and get some of those benefits from having two cars up at the front and having the strategy involved in trying to put pressure on that Red Bull. But we'll never know at this point and what would have played out in that running. Then we come to the two Ferraris, who kind of end up where they started off with in 6th and 5th. Basically, they had not a whole lot going on. They kind of had some contact with each other early on, where Sainz was trying to get by his teammate and kind of squeezing him a little more than his teammate liked. So we'll have to see if there's anything kind of comes up from that contact, even though I do kind of agree with Sainz that he was in the right on that was Charles that actually hit him in that regard. But from what some of the sayings was going on from Charles, that they weren't really supposed to be pushing on those set of tires, and so they shouldn't have been in that position to begin with. And I know they did swap positions later in the race. So on lap 55, they swapped positions, giving Charles Leclerc that 5th position and dropping Carlos Sainz back to that 6th where he started off with. Now, Carlos did pass Gasly on lap 39 for 7th and passed Ocon on lap 47 for 6th. So he made his way up in the field, and then they kind of swapped positions to run in kind of where they were. I thought they were thinking that at that point, Carlos could maybe put pressure on George, and he did get close, but not quite where he needed to be to have that extra oomph to get into that 4th position and pushing George back a little bit farther in that running. So I think that was the right strategy when they swapped positions. It just didn't quite play out the way they liked. But a decent run, not the greatest run for Ferrari. They still need to work on some of their strategy and their setup a little bit. I know they weren't quite as bad off as last week, but they were, still struggling a little bit, not quite where they should be with those Mercedes this week in that running. So they need to go back and look at all that data to try to analyze where they could improve and what they can kind of tweak on the Ferrari. So hopefully next week they can be more competitive and give a little bit more running for the front. Then we have George Russell, who did a really good job, even though it didn't turn out to be quite what he wanted. Starting off in 4th, gained 3 positions at the start of the race, going on the outside, having that double, aerodynamic of Lando and Max running that draft. That's what I was trying to think of. That draft from those double cars, fighting it out in that first corner, letting him gain that ground and then having the, ability and being that brave to be able to throw it on the outside and make it his way around without sliding off into that corner. It was really good. Gaining that first position in the first lap, game that was really, pretty outstanding driving, I think, for him. And then that Mercedes wasn't quite there. And when Max was able to get around him, that kind of settled it that he was going to be probably third in that running. And then Lewis basically came up and took that away with fresher tires in that regard. So that kind of led to that layout. But I think it was a good run for George. I think he did a really good job. I think he might be a little bit frustrated on the strategy that they played out of him being on those hard tires instead of the soft tires. But did a good job. He did pass Gasly on lap 38 for 6th and passed Ocon on lap 46th for 4th. And then I said, him fighting with Lewis. He did start off on softs, switched to mediums on lap 15, so decently where everybody else was, but switched to hards on lap 36, which then led to that mismatch in tires with his teammate. Whereas Lewis lost the position at the start. He was kind of complaining about that. His start was fairly poor. He was thinking that maybe he might have been a little bit closer to the front runners if he had done a better job in that starting lineup off the grid. But anyway, he did a decent job. He passed Alonso on lap 18 for 8th, passed Carlos Sainz on lap 19 for 6th, passed Sainz again on lap 46 for 6th, and passed George on lap 52 for 3rd. Lewis started off on softs, switched to mediums on lap 16, so just a lap behind his teammate, but then went to lap 43 versus George's 36, where he switched to a set of softs instead of the hards, which gave him that extra performance, I think, when he got back to George in that run, to give him that extra option to be able to get past him and put pressure on Lando. So that's kind of my thoughts on the Mercedes. I think they did a good job. They're really good pushing back from where they were. They were pretty much out of it, and now they're coming back more into the fight, which is always good to see, having an extra team in that battle up front. So hopefully they can continue that, and we'll see more action from them in the future. Now, Lando, he did lose 2 positions at the front, on the start of the race, I should say, due to that fight with Max, losing the fight with Max, and then, of course, as I said, George going on the outside where he couldn't quite make it, putting him back into 3rd, and then kind of fighting back from that position. He did pass Carlos Sainz for 4th on lap 27th, passed Lewis Hamilton on lap 32 for 3rd, and then he passed George on lap 35 for 2nd, kind of maintaining that space, gaining that ground back up from that lead that Max had, and then going through that. He did a soft, medium, soft, so he started off on softs, went to lap 23, switched to mediums, and then went to lap 47 on those medium tires before switching back to softs. Did a really good run for that. Ended up getting the fastest lap, so he got that extra point. Got the driver of the day, which I probably wouldn't think he'd probably be the driver of the day after basically losing it from Max, but we'll see. I would have probably gave it to Max as he started off in 2nd, kind of played it to his best advantage for the day on this run. So I think Max would be the driver of the day, if not possibly Lewis, as he was coming back in that Mercedes that hasn't been so good. But I can't really it's a hard time for me to give it to Lando, as he made that mistake at the very beginning, like he said on the radio. It was pretty much his fault, and then they kind of put him in that weird strategy, and I'm not sure if they made the strategy call correctly either on that regard, but that's a hard one to know. But anyway, decent job from Lando, getting points, keeping in the 2nd position, always good. And then, of course, you have Max, who ended up in 2nd place to start off the race and worked his way up to 1st. I have him taking second from Lando on turn 1, and then taking on lap the first position on lap 3 from George Russell, and then passing Oscar for third place on lap 21 after doing some of the pit strategy stuff. So he started off on softs, went to lap 17 to switch to mediums, went to lap 44 before switching back to softs. During that whole thing, I think he did a really good job of getting past and getting back in the lead to start through this race, and then kind of maintained that through the pit strategy. Even though he fell back in that regard, after coming out, he knew basically he was going to end up back into the lead eventually. So for the whole race, so on lap 10, Max had a 2.4 second lead. And then on lap 20, that had switched to a 4.4 second lead for Lando Norris because of Max's pit stop. And then on lap 35, it was an 8.4 second lead for Max as Max came back out and Lando had to pit. And so Lando was kind of behind everything. And then on lap 50, it was a 6.8 second lead ahead of Lando. And at the end, it was only a 2.2 second lead over Lando at the end. So Lando was coming back fairly strong, and I know Max was having to push it fairly hard all those laps, but still had a decent gap. It wasn't quite the battle I wanted to see at the end. I was hoping that Lando was going to be able to catch back up a little bit quicker, but doing all the lap traffic and everything, I think that hindered him in that strategy. But a really good race for Max Verstappen. Even though he didn't start off on pole, I think he was able to take advantage of the situation that he was in and pass George when he did to really solidify that first position and just kind of carry it off from that point forward without too much trouble from the people behind him. I think he did a really good job, and I think that's why he deserves the driver of the day. But who do you think is the driver of the day? Would you give it to Max? Would you give it to Lando? I could probably be switch around on that part. Anyway, if you made it this far, I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe if you want to see what is coming up in the next week or so as we have a triple header going on. And from this point, we can see the driver's standings. And so basically we have Esteban Ocon overtaking Alex Albon for 16th spot with that extra point that he made today. And we have Lando Norris taking over second position from Charles Leclerc for that second position. So he's the next runner up for Max, basically 69 points behind Max, but still in the running. Lando's done a really good job of points throughout the season, so he is still kind of in that running. I think there's going to be more pressure on Max, so we'll have to see how close that battle gets and if Lando can overtake him or if Charles is going to come back and try to fight for that position as well. So that's basically the changes there. And for the constructors standing, we basically have Alpine overtaking Haas with the double points that they gained again. So they have 8 points over Haas's 7 points. And of course you have Red Bull still in the lead with 330 and Ferrari having 270. So about the same, number of points behind the Red Bulls, even though they were farther in the back of the points than they would have liked to be. But of course, Max is the main point bringer for Red Bull, so that kind of plays out in that regard. And of course, McLaren gaining a little bit of ground on Ferrari as well. So that kind of lays out that. So what else is coming up is, of course, the Austria or Red Bull Ring next weekend, and that's going to be a sprint weekend. So the sprint race will be on June 29th, and the full-blown GP race will be on June 30th. So check your schedules to make sure you know when things are going to be happening on this race this next weekend. And if you want to hear what I have to say about that reaction for that race, please subscribe again. So this race is 2.683 miles long. Will be 71 laps being run for the main GP race for a total race distance of 190.42 miles. that was first introduced in 1970, and the lap record holder is Carlos Sainz with 1 minute 5.619 seconds. So we'll see if they can come close to that this next weekend. And again, it's a sprint weekend, so make sure you check your schedules on when things are happening, because you have that Saturday where the sprint qualifying and or the sprint race, and you have the sprint qualifying, of course, on the Friday. So we'll have to see how that plays out in this regard. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.